Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to Lisa and Dylan and the other organizers for persisting so that I could be here this afternoon. I'm very happy to talk to you about the work that we do at the International Rice Research Institute. And this is one of the most fascinating conferences I've ever been to. And so I would like to continue this conversation with you and this relationship with you, and hopefully by the end of this talk that we can talk about how we can do that. So this is where I work, literally. My office is to the left of these rice fields. IRRI, which is how we call the International Rice Research Institute, was founded in the 1960s. Through a grant from the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations and from the Philippine government. Now, the IRRI is a little different from other international organizations in the sense that we're autonomous, we're more like an NGO. Our relationship with countries is bilateral, meaning we have treaties with each of the countries that we work in. So we're independent of the United Nations, we're independent of the countries, and so in a sense, what our agenda is comes from an agreement within the consortium of international agricultural research centers. This is CGIAR. CGIAR is composed of about 15 organizations and centers that look at the agricultural produce of the world. So we're in charge of rice. There's a group that's in charge of livestock. They're located in Kenya. Their headquarters is in Kenya. The group in charge of wheat and maize is in Mexico. The World Vegetable Center is in Taiwan. The World Fish headquarters is in Cambodia. So you can see from the nature of the organizations that we're all in developing countries, because that's where our work is. Okay, so IRRI is in almost all places where rice is grown. So all the way from South Korea over there to Africa. Actually, in Africa, there is also Africa Rice. Africa Rice is our sister organization. They work in the western parts of Africa. We work in the southern and eastern parts of Africa. And Africa is one of those places where the consumption of rice is growing fastest. So in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, the consumption of rice has grown tenfold in some countries in Africa. So I heard one of our speakers earlier talking about the need to grow rice in Africa instead of exporting rice from Thailand to Africa. And that's one of the things that IRRI and Africa Rice are working on. Okay, so this is the kind of the life cycle of the rice plant from seed to all the way to milling. Well, it doesn't include the person, but this is how we work. And this entire process from seed to spoon takes anywhere from 4 to 5 months to more than a year, depending on some circumstances. For example, if this is how you make the rice, all manual, all traditional, the whole process can take more than 1 year, because some rice varieties, like the heirloom rice varieties that I have on display in one of the tables over there, and that I'm going to talk more about a little later, the planting duration is anywhere from 6 months to 10 months, compared to the more commercial rice varieties, which can take as little as 90 days. So you can see that a farmer who needs to eat, who needs to sell rice, might choose to raise a commercial variety because he can get 3 times more rice compared to growing a traditional variety. And 3 times more rice means 3 times more income, and maybe with some leftover for his family's consumption. If he goes traditional, he can grow maybe 1 crop a year. That's why traditional rices also cost much more, because it's an opportunity cost for the farmer. You can, you can also appreciate that takes a lot of energy to produce rice. There have been studies done on women from Africa who grow rice. During the peak of the agricultural activity, their energy requirements go up 3.5 times higher than during the low agricultural activity season. So that means during that period, if they're just about eating the same thing, they go into negative energy balance. That means they lose weight because they need to work so much harder. And why will they do it? Because that's how they survive. If farming is the way that they survive. The other thing you will notice is that in the West, the quintessential farmer is male. In the developing countries where rice is grown, it's both male and female. And I think people from Southeast Asia can relate to that because we can see that in our farms, it's not just the men. Of course, they do the heavier work, but the women do the more tedious work. The transplanting, the weeding, the harvesting, the processing is done by women. If you do it this way, you can have your rice from seed to spoon in 4 to 5 months. But as you can see, you'll need machines to do that. And in many parts of Asia, well, not Thailand, because Thailand has these huge tracts of land, but where the countries have small plots of land, machines are not always the answer because you don't have this, the space for them to use, to be used. I don't know if you will notice in the middle, that's a cell phone, because we are now working on technology that will allow the farmers to manage their crops according to the characteristics of their soil and their environment. So they can have weather data on their cell phones, they can have the acidity of their soil, they can have the kinds of pests that are now invading the farms around them so that they can do something about it in anticipation. So this is where the technology is going, and the farmers love it. They just love using smartphones. I don't have those pictures. I don't have the time to show them to you, but we have some very excited farmers using smartphones in farms across Asia. So I told you about the energy requirements to produce rice, but the more machines we use, of course, the less energy we will require. And that's not just true of farmers, that's true of every one of us, that the physical activities that we now engage in is so much less than they were, let's say, from the time of our parents or the time of our grandparents and even earlier than that. So that is why we are experiencing a nutrition transition. That's how we call it in nutrition. And this nutrition transition means that there's changing need for nutrients and therefore changing needs for food, including staples like rice. So I heard the person earlier was talking about corn. Actually, we don't produce as much corn, but more rice is eaten. Because as you heard from him, half of the corn that's produced is not eaten by humans, whereas most of the rice that we produce is eaten by humans. It's a staple for half the world, and 70% of the rice produced is produced by smallholder farmers, not these huge commercial or corporate producers of grain, which you find for corn and for wheat, but smallholders. And for some countries, rice can provide up to 80% of the calories. It's not because rice has that much more calories, it's because they don't eat too much of anything else. And that's important to consider when you think about some of the things that we need to do in Erie in order to meet the needs of these farmers. So this is a distribution of the rice calorie supply by region, and so it's not surprising that in Asia, much more of our calories comes from rice compared to the other countries. And if you look at it by country, so this is, I think, the top 12 or the top 15 countries, you will see some countries from Africa there. So countries like Cambodia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, up to 70% of their calories comes from rice. So that's how important rice is to meet food security needs in these countries. And that if ever there was a catastrophe that would happen to their rice crop, then hunger will definitely occur in those countries. So that's one of the mandates of IRRI, is to address poverty and to address hunger and malnutrition. So this was, before I came to IRRI, this was kind of how they defined their work, from genes to farmers' fields. So we do a lot of genetic studies, not to produce GMOs. We do a lot more of that to characterize the genetic makeup of the rice grain. And that is because we can shortcut the breeding cycles if we understand the genes of the rice better. And each variety will have its own makeup of genes. So we call it metabolomics. It's like metabolism, but the genetic functions and the genetic operations of the rice grain. And that shortens, so instead of, if you want a particular trait in your rice plant or in your rice grain, sometimes you have to have 6 to 8 generations of planting before you can see that you have a stable production of that particular trait. With a genetic approach, we are able to shorten that to maybe 1 or 2 or 3 seasons, or 3 cycles of planting. And so we can produce better rice in a much faster time. We also have the Global Gene Bank for rice grains. So this is in IRRI, in the Philippines, in Los Baños. And we have been collecting these rice varieties since the 1960s. So we have more than 3,000 different rice varieties, each of them unique. Sometimes I know some countries will say they have 20,000 varieties, but some of them are copies of other varieties, so they just add them up. But when you go down to the genes, then we have about 3,000. And all of the seeds that we have are also kept in Norway, in Svalbard. That is the global seed repository, so that if anything happens to the gene bank in the Philippines, there is a backup in Norway. And if there is, and all of the countries are also encouraged to have their own gene bank, so that the rice that they have is also in their gene banks for their own use and for their own research. Because farmers will grow what they want to grow. Sometimes some varieties of rice are neglected, either because it takes too much effort to grow them, they require so much more water, or it takes too long to grow them. We want to make sure that those varieties can be preserved for future use, because sometimes they have other traits, like they are more resistant to some fungi or some viruses, and that may be traits that we would like to have other rice varieties to have. So all of those genetic work is going on. I don't have time to discuss the others because I only have 1 minute left, and I do want to get, so I'm going to skip this because I do want to get to heirloom rice, which is actually one of the motivations for coming here. So these are rice terraces in the Philippines. You have very similar rice terraces all over Southeast Asia. I have samples of these 12 varieties. Sorry, not enough for eating, but just to see. They're on the table over there. And for those of you who don't know where the Cordillera is, it's in the northern part of Luzon, which is the biggest island in the Philippines. So I don't have time to read this. I'm just going to show you the rice fields. One of the things that I'd like you to remember from these rice fields is that different varieties are growing side by side. That's because as far as the farmers can tell, they might look similar. But when you look at the genetic variation, they're actually very different. So sometimes the quality of the rice that they produce may vary, not because of some problems with the rice, but because the farmers themselves are not that conscious about the fact that these rice plants will breed across each other. Sometimes when they grow rice and there is an empty spot, they will get a rice plant from one plot and stick it in there because it's a waste of space. And up in these mountains, space and water are very limited resources. So that's one of the things. Based on the genetic characterization, we're very concerned that quite a number of these varieties are near extinction, meaning that there are very few farmers who grow them in very limited land. So what we're trying to do is find out, which of them are related to each other. So we're clustering them by their genetic variation. We're trying to help them through all of the problems they have with water sourcing, with maintaining the terraces, with drying so that the product becomes safer. They don't dry it on the streets where chickens and pigs and all other kinds of things can happen to the rice grain. We're introducing solar bubbles so that the rice can dry inside the solar bubbles and be clean and safe using energy from the sun. We also, I think this was an event that Chef Jelle had participated in, the Madrid Fusion in the Philippines about 2 years ago now. 2 years ago. So we had a tasting session there so that we could get the sensory evaluation of the people who attended Madrid Fusion. So we do this also. This is not work from the Philippines because it's still ongoing, but in terms of the nutrition profile, you can see from the blue and the red and the purple, these are the antioxidants that are in different kinds of rice. So black rice, red rice, brown rice, white rice, you can see that the patterns are different. One of the things that you have to remember, though, about these antioxidants is that many of the things we do to rice in terms of the processing and the cooking removes a lot of these antioxidants. So that's a subject also for research for us. We're trying to see what are the ways where we can retain as much of the antioxidants in the rice so that they can contribute to the health and nutrition of people. I wanted to draw your attention to this, so this is on your left side polished rice, on your right side is unpolished rice. You have slightly more calories from the unpolished rice. That means the bran layer is intact because that's where the lipids of the rice grain are. So you have slightly more, but not a lot. I mean, you don't really get fat from the fat in rice. You get fat from the calories in rice. We can talk about that later. And the other is that you get 2.5 times more fiber in unpolished rice compared to polished rice. So unpolished is what we call the brown rice, brown because of the bran layer that surrounds the rice grain. We're trying to help the farmers also to form cooperatives. You heard our colleague from Indonesia that no one farmer produces enough rice for marketing to scale. So we're trying to get them into cooperatives so that we can gather them and bring their rice together, the ones that are most similar. We have helped them get a trademark, and now we're working towards geographical indication policy. So geographical indication is where you link the product to its origins and its cultural heritage, like Champagne or Gruyere or Colombian coffee. So we want to do the same for Cordillera rice so that it can be the farmer, to protect the farmers forever. Because a trademark has a limited time frame, but a geographical indication will not change because it's based on the geographical origin. So that's one of the things that we're also helping them with, and we are documenting their codes of practice so that because we have aging farmers, there are less and less farmers, we want to keep their traditions intact or alive as long as we can, and the codes of practice are being written down so that they are in black and white and not just in the memories of farmers who may die. So this is our goal, to have healthier rice, and really our aim is to have rice that is more responsive to the health and nutrition needs of people and not just to have enough yield for people to eat. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cecilia.